But want to encourage you to grab a Bible and follow along with us. We're going to be in all of chapter 16 today. And this is a story that when I kind of read through it, I'm like, you ever just come to a point in the Bible, a chapter or a story that you're like, can we just skip over this one? Like, I'd love to skip this one and go straight to chapter 17. I think the reason is, like, last week was such a high for Abram, right? This guy that we've been following for a while, right? This guy, Abram, who God has called out on his land of his own, and he's going to work a major work in this guy's life to bring about a people that are going to bless the world. And last week was such a high for him. This moment of faith in his life, this moment of faith that led to this credited righteousness by God. It's like a saving faith, saving moment in his life. And it was all based on him believing this promise that God was going to give him children like the stars of the sky. And today is such an epic failure on his part. An epic failure on his part that is directly related to the promise of this children of the stars of the heaven. And at first glance, you're like, oh, let's just skip this one. It's so bad. But then as I was thinking through that, God just reminded me, man, if I was telling the story of my life, if I was telling the different chapters of my life, there's a lot of stories, a lot of chapters I'd want to skip as well. And so we need to see this. We need to see that in the middle of misery and difficulty and bad choices and sin and its results, that God's still present in that. His promises are still there. That's the reason he's crediting righteousness, is because we are not. Abram's not going to establish righteousness on his own. And so it's a story of all of that. And so let's jump in here together. Let's see what God has for us. And we'll walk through this difficult story and still see the beauty of God caring for his people, caring for specifically the person affected most by the sin that we see in the story. So let me go ahead and start reading it, and then we'll just start breaking it apart like we tend to do. So Genesis chapter 16, we'll start in verse 1 here. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar." Okay, so just real quickly off the top there, we're just setting the scene, give you a couple main characters. Of course, Abram is going to be a character in the story, as he tends to be in all of them recently. But you have this, you have Sarai. Sarai, we've been introduced to her before. She is, of course, the wife of Abram, the one who Abram gave up to an Egyptian pharaoh when he was down in Egypt. But then you see this other person, another character jumping into the story, a lady named Hagar. Now, Hagar, what we see here is that she was an Egyptian servant, a maidservant, or a personal attendant to Sarai. Personal attendant is somebody back in ancient times who would have taken care of Sarai, who would have helped her with the responsibilities she had in life and family, also help her take care of children if she had children. And it says that she was Egyptian. So we don't know fully where she jumps into the family and clan of Abram. But the assumption probably is while Sarai was down in Egypt and in Pharaoh's house, this was probably a maidservant she had there that followed with them when they left Egypt. So we're introduced to these two new characters. The thing that we see there so far is that with Sarai, the main thing that we're pointing out with her is that she still has no children at this point. And if you remember last week, like the promise, the big promise that God gave to Abram was, hey, your kids are going to be like the stars of the sky. And it's starting off the story here like, okay, we're still waiting, no children. Story goes from there in verse 2. It says, "Then Sarai said to Abram, 'Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant, that it may be that I shall obtain a child by her.'" This so reminds me of a couple different things. One is the story a few weeks back where Abram went down into Egypt. It's that idea of this is the point in the story where Sarai and Abram need to be invoking the wisdom of God. They need to be petitioning to God and saying, hey, God, you promised us the children like the stars of the sky. We still don't have any kids. Like, what's up? Like, please help us. Please answer our prayers. Please give us, seek the wisdom of God. This is a story like that you're not going to see until like verse 6 or 7, somewhere down later. This is the first time you see a reference of God. This is, again, like that other story, that they have a lack of patience in waiting for the promise of God, and it leads to a desire on their own to seek their own wisdom to solve their own problems. it's very similar to Genesis chapter 3. That's the other point here. Like you're going to see a lot of different components that are like Genesis 3 and the fall between Adam and Eve. And it's that idea, all of it stems from this idea of, I can't wait and trust God. I need to take matters into my own hands and take care of matters my own, because God's not being faithful. God's not giving what he did. It shows a lack of faith and a lack of trust, and God's not delivering, or at least not delivering in my time frame. And so I have to jump in. Sarai is jumping in and coming up with a plan. And I think from the outside, us looking in, like, this is a horrible plan that she comes up with. But how many times have we done horrible plans that we couldn't tell while we're cooking up those plans? Everyone around us is probably like, man, that is the dumbest thing Brandon's ever done. But you just can't see it sometimes when you're stuck in the mess. So, the first point here, like, stop, Sarai. Stop invoking your own wisdom to solve your own problems. Be patient and wait for God. Of course, that's not what's going to take place. She actually says, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Of course, the idea of prevented me is the same idea of holding back. That the Lord is holding back from me. He's preventing me, holding back something good for me. This is very similar wording to what you see in Genesis 3, right? It's the idea of the serpent telling Eve, hey, God's holding back from you. That's something good, the knowledge you'll get from eating that fruit. And it's the same idea here, that God's keeping something good from you. I mean, he promised to give it to you, stars of the sky kind of thing, right? But now here it's like, no, God's holding back from you. He's keeping you from something good. And that's what she's saying. She's blaming God and saying God's holding back good, and nothing. God doesn't say anything here. It's a big question. Like, did God hold back from her? God's not holding back from her. He's promised to give her the children like the stars of the sky. She just needs to be patient. Abram needs to be patient, which is such a hard thing for us, right? I mean, we can get mad at them, but it's tricky for us as well. So she, in her lack of patience, she cooks up an idea because she feels like God's holding back on her. And she says that she's going to take her servant, Hagar, the Egyptian servant, the handmaid, and she is going to give her to Abram to obtain a child. And she says specifically that Sarai, may obtain a child through her. This is almost like, the thought I have in my head is like ancient surrogate mom or something, right? But of course, this is Hagar actually having her own child. And Sarai has this intention in the beginning that when she has this child, that child is going to be hers. She's going to have it. It's going to be her child. So this is her plan she's cooking up. Now, we could see a million different ways this is going to go bad, and it's going to go bad a lot of different ways. But her desire is, I want a child. I can't have it. God's preventing me, so I'm going to have my servant step in and give me a child through her for my husband. So it says that she, in the next point here, Abram listened to her. Second half of verse 2. Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. So it gives the idea that, like, Abram, this is the point. Like, this is why you're following the story of Genesis 3 too, right? The idea of, like, God's holding back, eat the fruit, and Eve wants to eat the fruit, and then she says to her husband, hey, who's sitting there, how about you eat the fruit with me? Like, it's the idea of the man in both these stories. Their great sin is neglect. It's not standing up and helping make wise, good decisions. It's following along with bad decisions. And so Abram here listens to her, and it throws this point out that it's been 10 years that they've been in the land in Canaan. You're going to see at the very end of this story that at the point where Abram has this child with Hagar, that he's 86 years old. So when he left Haran with his father and went out and followed God, both to the promised land, then to Egypt, then back to the promised land, it's a 10-year period. From 75 years of age to 86 or so years of age, he's been following God in this thing and never has had a child in that process. And God's promising a child, and they're just wrestling with, okay, when is this going to happen? Right? Like, how many of our bad decisions or our lack of following the wisdom of God come about because of a lack of patience? Right? How much right now? Like, it's hard in the season we're going through right now to continue to be patient. Right? Like right now we're going through a mess of life and restructuring of everything, and it's been 2 months. Those 2 months feel like 2 years. Right? We're not good with patience. to walk through a difficult, long season. I think about how many biblical stories and characters had to walk through lifelong or major points of their life, these big, difficult stories, difficult things they went through, and they were long, and like to be patient through this long suffering scenario. And the lack of patience leads to bad decisions on their part. And so it says that Sarai, the second half of verse 3, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. So this goes a little further than what the initial thought was here. So first it says, she took her and gave her to Abram. Again, wording from Genesis 3, right? She took the fruit and gave it to her husband. I mean, that's what the story is trying to get us to see. That even Abram, after his moment of faith that led to credited righteousness, he still has some of that Genesis 3 rebellion in him. And this whole story invokes that. So it's the idea she takes what she shouldn't be taking. She takes a person and forces something on a person that shouldn't be forced on her. And she gives her to Abram to be his wife, it says. Now that's all kinds of wrong. Like, I feel like this thing's spiraling out of control the thought I had was like a Jerry Springer episode. Now, those who are younger, I need to update my reference there, right? Like that was 20 years ago. What is it now? Is it Dr. Phil or something else? Is like the crazy stories where people make crazy decisions and the blow up that happens after that. This is what's going on here. And you have, he takes her, gives her to her, and the decision is she's going to become my wife. Why is he taking a second wife? Right? Like you might say, some people say, well, God doesn't say he shouldn't have a second wife. Some people will say God doesn't step in and do much here. God made it very clear in Genesis 2, go back and read it, that he made Eve to be Adam's wife and that the two were to become one flesh. Two becoming one flesh. Not three becoming one flesh. It was two to become one flesh. The first time you see somebody taking a second wife is out of the line of Cain. It's Lamech, right? Lamech is the guy who's seen as like the archetype of evil and rebellion against God. So by no means is this a good godly decision. This is a horrible decision they're making. That she's going to become your wife and she's going to bear a child. So no longer, it's changed from she's just going to give me a child so Sarai can have a child. Now she's going to become a second wife of Abram, and this thing's spiraling out of control really quick. It says here in verse 4 that he went in to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong be done to me be on you." All right, so this is the story is going a little bit further. Here, Abram takes her as his wife. He conceives a child with her. She is pregnant with a child, and she then looks with contempt on her mistress. So again, like the story here, she is a maidservant. Her position is to be a help for Sarai, to raise children, to care for Sarai and the tasks that she has. And now that she's been able to get pregnant, she looks with contempt, the idea of dismissal or belittling. She's looking down on Sarai. She's elevated herself to a status to where now she's more important. She can do something that Sarai can't, and she looks with contempt, belittlement. She looks down on Sarai, and Sarai does not take this well. She goes directly to Abram, says, "What's going on here?" All right, she says, "May the wrong done to me be on you." So it's this idea, of course, with the results, with our stupid decisions, come really negative outcomes. So you see all kinds of relational struggle and strife taking place here. And in the midst of all of that, you have the idea that, like we saw in Genesis 3, the blame shifting. It's not my fault, it's the woman's fault. It's not my fault, it's the woman you gave me. It's your fault, God. Here, Sarah's like, "Hey, what's going on here? Take care of her. This is on you, Abram." She says, I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. So this is the first time you see the Lord, Yahweh, brought up, and it's not in a positive light, right? She's saying, "Hey, Abram, I gave her to your embrace to have a child. Now she is treating me with contempt. She's treating me as though I'm second nature, unimportant, whatever else. Like she's treating me with contempt, and she's saying, she's invoking the Lord to judge this whole situation. Who's right and who's wrong in here? Almost like if you were God, you'd be like, hey, you're all wrong. You're all a mess, right? But she's saying, the Lord judge between you and me. Is it my fault? No, this is Abram, this is your fault. Yeah, it's both your fault, to be honest. So here's what Abram's response is. Again, his response is like just finding a way out to not have to deal with stuff. Verse 6. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Again, he's not taking responsibility. It's the idea of like Genesis 3 when God comes back. It's like, it's not my fault. It's the woman you gave me. It's her fault. Here, it's like, Abram's like, I'm not taking responsibility here. She's your servant. She's under your control. You deal with her. Deal with her however you want to deal with her. It's that neglect that actually gives permission to abuse of what's taking place in this situation. That's why I said I want to skip chapter 16 and move on, but there is a lot to learn from this. So then it says, second half of verse 6, that Sarai dealt harshly with her. We don't know the details of that, but there's a harsh, ungodly character or treatment that comes from Sarai to Hagar in this situation. And the result is Hagar flees from her. She leaves the family, she leaves the protection of the family, the clan, and she's out on her own. You actually see that it says later here that she went to a spring of Shur. She's heading south. She's heading towards Egypt. It's almost like she's heading home at this point. Just pause for a second to see all of this. The only time God's invoked in the story so far is when they're trying to use God as a way to set themselves up as free from any kind of responsibility, and that God's judgment should be on the other person. This is a lack of patience in the promise of God. It's taking matters into their own hands. It's selfishness. It's horrible decisions. It's using people, and all of it leads to just this complete dysfunction in relationship. Abram's mad at Sarai. Sarai's mad at Abram. Hagar's mad, thinking she's better than Sarai. Sarai's mad at Hagar. Just a trifecta of relational mess that's going on from this. And the difficulty of all this, like, this is where I can see the important relation. Like when I was saying in the beginning, you want to skip this chapter. And I want to skip chapters in my story and in my life. And this is a story that you want to skip that's after the saving faith that Abraham had last week. How many stories even in my life after the saving faith in Jesus Christ do I want to skip or move over? And it shows to me that that's why God gave righteousness last week to Abram. That's why God credits and gives righteousness to me. He takes my sin and gives to me righteousness through the righteousness of Jesus. Because left to my own devices, there's chapters in my story that are very Genesis 3 chapters that you want to completely skip over and ignore, even after faith in Jesus Christ. The story moves on and God shows up, like he always tends to do in such a beautiful way. He shows up with grace and love in the story in verse 7. It says, the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur, again of going down towards Egypt. So the Lord Yahweh, the personal name, the Lord, personal God, shows up, and he shows up in a messenger, in an angel. The actual definition means messenger. And so verse 80 says that the angel, the messenger, said to Hagar, the servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. That's strange, right? Like, I don't know your thought. When I'm reading through this, I'm like, okay, one is like, it's beautiful that God shows up. And he shows up not to Abram, not to Sarai. He shows up to the one most mistreated in this story, Hagar. And Hagar's left the family, the protection of the family and the clan. She's out in the wilderness on her own, making her journey back down to Egypt. And this is a scary place for a woman on her own, a pregnant woman on her own to be. and God shows up to her. That's beautiful in and of itself, right? God, the Lord Yahweh, sends a messenger, an angel, someone to comfort, to be with her, to walk with her, to be there, to be present with her. Like the beautiful thing there. But then the response seems like, really? That's where we're going to go, God? God's response to her is, hey, go back. Where are you going? Go back to Sarai, and then the word after that, submit to her. Oh, that's hard to think, right? And there's sometimes, and I think we have to wrestle with this tension in the Scriptures. There's going to be many times that God does something in the Scriptures, and it just naturally it leads to us like that's the response. There's a questioning or a second guessing of like, God, that's what you're going to do in this situation. And I think it's healthy and good for us to process and wrestle through that. Now, I think sometimes we're going to find some answers that I think will give us some clarity, and I think there's a few pieces here that'll help us understand why God's making this choice. But the other thing is, even when we can't get it all, there's just that piece where we have to be reminded that God has a better understanding of all things than we do. And what we're going to see in the storyline of the Scriptures is He is a good God. And if we can trust that He is a good God, and the overlining story of the Bible is He is a good God. If we can trust that, then even in these times where we second guess or have our questions about the response He has sometimes, we can understand that He's a good God and much more knowledgeable and understanding of everything than we are. So there's this ability to trust even in the unknown. But I think there's a couple pieces in here that can help give us a little insight of what's going on with Hagar and why God would say to go back. One is, like I said, I alluded to a second ago, a woman in the ancient world leaving protection of family, clan, all of that, and traveling on her own, like this is almost certainly a death sentence for her. To leave that protection, to be out on your own, the results are not going to be good for her. She needs to go back, as hard as it is, to where protection is going to be for her. And then the other piece in there, I think, is Hagar. As much as she seems to be the victim of this story, was she perfect in all of this? She wasn't perfect in all of this, right? When she did conceive, she had contempt on her mistress. She had this haughty, proudful heart and actions towards her mistress. And now there's a whole lot of cultural connotations, connections that we don't maybe connect in our world, in our day and age. But we can relate to the idea that even though have you ever had those scenarios where somebody wrongs you big time and your response is a wrong in return? It might be a much smaller wrong than what they did, and so you feel a little justified in it. But how often has, at least in my life when those situations have come up, God has still forced me to deal with my minor sin, whatever that really is, right, in the larger offense that's done against me. Many times. Times where people have mistreated me and my response isn't always the godly response, and sometimes it's a jab or something I shouldn't have done. And then later it's like God still comes back to me and says, yeah, Brandon, you were mistreated poorly in that situation, but you can't control somebody else's actions. You still have to deal with your own. And it's almost like, and that's a hard one, right? How many times I've had to go up and apologize to somebody for something I did, even when I realized that like they did something that seems far worse to me that invoked my bad action, and they're not going to apologize to me, but God doesn't care about all that. He cares, but for me, He cares about me dealing with my own stuff. And so there's going to be some humility necessary even in Hagar's situation to go back to her mistress and deal with her own stuff, even if it's minor in comparison to what was done to her. I think there's a good godly lesson to learn even in that, as hard as that is from time to time. So she's going to return. He says to her to return, but then he also gives her this really great promise, similar thing that he gave to Abram last week. It says, the angel of the Lord in verse 10 said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. I love that. And his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all of his kinsmen. So this promise the Lord gives to her is very similar. And of course, this is an ancient Israel time, whatever. This is key for them. The idea of having children, They're of course following the divine mandate to fill the earth, to subdue it, to add to the creation. And so Hagar's here is given a great promise by God that this child you're having, Ishmael, is going to have a large family lineage as well. And it says these strange things about him, right? There's going to be like fighting going on. He's a fighter. He's a wild donkey of a man, right? Like, I don't know why the ESV doesn't translate as it should, right? Donkey, what it means here, like he's going to be a jerk. He's going to be that guy, right? While it seems like, is that the kind of son I want? Think about it in Hagar's situation. Hagar is a servant, a helpmaid. She is under someone else's authority and control. And what you see from her son is he's going to be strong and independent. And so there's a blessing that comes to her through these words of the messenger of Yahweh. And I want to hone in on a couple different pieces here. It says that you shall call his name Ishmael. Ishmael translated means God hears. And it goes right along with that next line, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. I think that's one of the most beautiful aspects of this story, is that in the midst of all this mess and drama and relational junk and bad decisions and all of that, the Lord shows up to those who are afflicted and hurt the most, and he sees her. He sees her. That's why the God who hears, he listens to what's going on. He's present and knows the affliction that's going on to this person. He hears about the afflictions and listens to the afflictions. And I think it plays into this next line of the actual name that Hagar is going to give to God, the messenger, and God through the messenger. Verse 13, she says, so she called the name of the Lord who spoke with her. It's actually El Roi. She spoke with her and named him El Roi, which means you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. You are a God of seeing. You are one who looks after me. I wonder, like, just that for today, like, that seems like the big point of meditation in here. In the midst of all the mess and drama and decisions that was made, poor decisions that were made, without trying to ask God's wisdom or seek his wisdom, that from the destruction that comes out of that, those who are afflicted, God sees, he listens, he hears, he sees what's going on, and he looks after them. How many times has that been you and I in our lives? How many times have we been in a situation that out of the effect of sin around us, not even necessarily our own sin, even maybe partially our sin, there's just negative stuff that has hit our life and just a ball of drama and difficulty and sin. And we need to realize that in that mess, God is still present. He is a God of seeing. He is a God of listening. He sees the affliction and he looks after us. Goes on from there in verse 14 that therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. My best try there. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. The actual well there, the translation of it is the well of the living one who sees me. See, the well they've named after the living one who sees and looks after. Verse 15, it says, Hagar bore Abram a son, so she does go back as the Lord told her to. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, who Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So she goes back home, has the child. Abram responds with a public declaration that this is his child and this is his son, and all that goes along with that. And it says at this point that Abram is 86 years old. It's an interesting story here, right? Again, we don't see the outcome for Sarai and Abram because God seems more interested in caring for and looking after the one that seems to be the most victim in this situation, which seems to be the ongoing character of God you'll see throughout the scriptures. I think the few key things for us to think through here is that, again, we need to be reminded that instead of a lack of patience and making rash decisions, let's invoke and seek out the wisdom of God in our decisions that we have. Right? We've talked through this right now. Like, we're going through unprecedented times for us. Not that other generations haven't gone through this kind of stuff. But let's be patient. Let's be patient through this, seeking the wisdom of God rather than trying to take things in our own hands and figure things out on our own. And as they do this, when humanity tends to do this, this is that Genesis 3 problem. The fruit, I'm going to take it, I'm going to give it to others, I'm not going to take blame, and the disaster that comes after that. How many disasters in our life are we the result of a disaster of someone else's decisions or our own decisions that are invoked in our own wisdom instead of following the wisdom of God? It leads to just a wake of relational disaster. And I think it's key for us to be reminded of that. And then in all of that, in the mess of what Sarai did, the mess of what Abram did, the mess of all of it, God hasn't left them. Right? This is why God had this credited righteousness moment last week. And this is why God credits and gives to you and I forgiveness of our sin and righteousness, because on our own, in our stories, in those chapters of our stories that we don't want to tell, that we don't want to think about, God is the righteousness in that situation. God is the one that forgives our sin, because so many times in our life we do the opposite. We take matters into our own hand. And so God gives the righteousness we can't have and can't do on our own. Not only does he do that, but he did it with Abram, but he also has covenant relationship with them. Remember that covenant he made last week? He's in covenant relationship with them. That isn't going to leave because of the dumb decisions that takes place in chapter 16. The covenant relationship you and I have through Jesus Christ is not going to leave because of the dumb decisions you and I have made post our salvation or our faith and trust in Jesus Christ. God's continuing to be good and faithful and covenant relationship with you and I, and it's only there because God forgives our sins and gives us righteousness in Jesus. We continue to have Genesis 3 moments in our story. Chapters that we want to skip over, chapters that we don't want to think about, but God continues to be faithful, continues to be covenant relationship partners with us, and continues to forgive and continues to give to us righteousness. Also, we see here a God who absolutely cares for, sees, and goes after the afflicted, those that are mistreated, and he goes after them, and he shows them that he cares for them. The same wording that was seen, like he's a God of seeing, and he looks after me, is what Hagar said. So depending on what side we're at in all of this, right? Are we tempted to be impatient and seek kind of our own decision making? Like let's pull back that rein and let's seek God's wisdom and let's be patient. We've made bad decisions. We've invoked really horrible decisions and had the outcomes that you see in this situation or similar to this situation. Let's be reminded that God, that's why he forgave us. That's why he gave us righteousness, and he's still in covenant relationship with you and I. Maybe you're someone today who's just feeling the affliction of the sin around you and the bad decisions of people around you. And yes, you got your own stuff that you have to deal with, and you need to go make it right, but you need to see that God sees you. He sees the affliction that you're under, and he cares, and he's with you, and he's a God that's going to look after you. A lot for us to think through in a chapter that it would have been easier just to skip over. But let me just take a moment. We'll pray. As always, I just want to continue to encourage you to think through what it is that God is using in this passage to draw you to closer relationship with him. What is he trying to show about himself to comfort you in a difficult time? What is he showing you about his continual love and forgiveness of you? And maybe the end of all of that, we can have chapters that are better decisions, better parts of our story that are where we're patient and waiting for the wisdom of God rather than taking matters into our own hands. So let's take a moment to pray. I'll pray for you. Take a moment for then you to pray as well. We'll move into a time of communion, and in that time, let's just meditate on what it is the Spirit's been leading you through here today. So let me go ahead and pray, and then we'll move on today. So Father, thank you so much. Thank you for your word. Thank you for even tough chapters and stories like this. And it reminds us of your goodness and your faithfulness and your covenant relationship apart from our ability to make good and right decisions all the time. Lord, help us to see ourselves in Sarah and Abraham and the poor decisions we've made sometimes from our lack of patience and just a desire to take matters into our own hands. Help us, Lord, to be patient. Help us to follow you and your faithfulness and your goodness. Lord, remind us of your covenant relationship with us, the fact that you're a forgiving God, you're a loving God, you're a righteousness bestowing God. Lord, help us to see you as that. And Lord, anyone who's suffering any kind of affliction today and hearing these words, Lord, I pray that they would see you as a God who sees and a God who cares and a God who's there for them to walk with them each and every step of the day. Lord, be with us today. We love you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.